Thanks everybody for coming tonight to Rocky Mountain Angular. I'm super happy that you're here, and I'm really excited to be here. Been doing a lot of traveling lately. I just spoke in Indianapolis. They're kind of teasing me a little bit about Cypress IO. I just did a great talk in Indy on Cypress IO. I'm really excited about it. So if you haven't used it, like go check it out. It changes how you do testing. We'll probably be doing a meetup on that at some point here really soon. So I'm really excited to talk about that as well at some point. Also got invited to the Teamworks, what is that? The Frameworks Summit. Brian and I both went out there, and I taught a one-day Angular class out there. Apparently, John Papa wasn't able to make it, so I was able to fill in, and really happy about being able to help out the community there. So it's great to learn about the different frameworks and how change detection works between the different ones, and just kind of the similarities and the differences and how much we all work together. So, all right, so this talk is really about NgRx and what if I'm not ready? You know, we talk about NgRx and when we start talking about building applications, a lot of the buzz right now is all around NgRx, man. You need to use NgRx, man. It's really gonna help and make things better. And what if I'm not quite ready for that? What if this is like, I just need to find a way I can kick off my application and get stuff done and not have to worry about some of these more complex pieces. So there's a lot of things like NgRx, NgRx Actions, NgXS, NgRx Data, MobX. Anybody heard of any of these? Yeah, anybody using like NgXS, NgRx Data? No? So there's all these choices out there. It's a little bit overwhelming for as a developer when I'm starting an application. How do I deal with this? As well as if I already have an application that has a little bit of complexity, but I'm not quite there yet to say, hey, I'm ready to bite the bullet to do NgRx and do it right, then this talk is for you. This might be a really nice intermediate step for you, and also give you the ability to then have an application that's ready to go to NgRx. Because that's the other really big thing here, is making sure that our applications are extendable and that we don't code ourselves into a spot. So when we talk about NgRx, there's a lot to learn with NgRx. We got actions, we got reducers, effects, selectors. So we think about actions. We need to have an action for every single thing the system can do and the user can do. So it's a little bit overwhelming. So we think about, okay, I want to load all customers. Okay, so I need to load customers. I need to load customer success. I need to load customers fail. I need a update customer, insert customer with a success and a fail. So it starts to be really a lot of stuff going on. And then we have to write reducers for each one of those, effects to handle the service calls that are going out, and then selectors to be able to get the data back out of the store. Wow, right? It's a lot to take on when I'm starting to just try to build an application and get things going. So, you know, the first thing that we start to think about is, do I even need NgRx? You know, there's so much planning involved. Actual application complexity comes up. It's like, well, it seems kind of simple right now. I know there's a couple of pages that have a little bit of complexity to them that I could use a little bit of help with, but I'm not sure that I'm really to that point where I'm ready to bite the bullet with NgRx. And I want to start simple. Right? When we kick off an application, we want to get going soon, right? We want to get going right now. Let's start building some stuff and let's start seeing what we can produce here and start to get some feedback. And then the really big question here that I always think about is, what if I want to upgrade later? So there's other patterns out there that I can implement, but they don't really lend themselves well to being able to upgrade to NgRx later. And so then we kind of get ourselves coded into a corner. And then before we know it, you know, things get complex and bam, we're kind of hosed. So we need to have a way that we can find an intermediate here. So architecture goals with this is we want to maximize code reuse. I know this has always been a buzzword, like, man, let's create components that we can share between teams. And, you know, you could use my components. I don't really like your components as much, but here's mine, you can use them and whatnot, right? Anybody ever have that, right? Not me, of course. So maximizing code reuse so that we really have reusable components and not components that are that we're going to have to do a lot of extension on or create a lot more complex decision trees inside of them so that they'll work for our use case. The other thing we want to be able to do is share data between components. So a lot of times we have data that's on a page that we need to share between multiple components, and then we're trying to figure out what's the best way to share it. Who has like a session service right now in their application? Anybody? Come on, don't lie to me. I know we all have some sort of service that, hey, we're first going to put roles in there, or first we'll actually start usually with something innocuous like, hey, I'm going to put the user's token for authentication. Put their authentication token into the service because, hey, it's a singleton. It'll be available everywhere. We'll be able to get that out of the service, and we'll be able to put that into our HTTP calls, right? And then we add roles to it because, man, if we've got the authentication piece, man, we're going to want roles, and we're going to check that later. And then, before we know it, we start adding some other things like permissions and a little bit bigger. And we keep adding and adding. And it becomes like this file that Kevin was talking about earlier. Before we know it, it's 1,000 lines of code in it. It has a header, says, do not touch, this thing's toxic. You will break, production, please contact Jesse before ever touching this, And I've been there, like this happens, it's really easy to get there. So sharing data between components isn't always easy. And the other problem with this kind of shared data is we're storing it as an array or as a single object. And so then the problem is we come up with this other scheme to update and tell components, hey man, roles have changed. Permissions have changed. This other entity has changed. You need to update yourself. You need to go get this data and re-render yourself. So it's not a real efficient way of doing things. And so really what we want to do is we want to stream the data. So when we get new data that comes in, we want to be able to update the stream, and then the stream updates and tells all the components, hey, you have new data, you need to go re-render yourself. And the other thing that we want to do is one of the goals of NgRx, and why you'd even consider NgRx, is to reduce complexity. So even though we're not using NgRx, we still want to reduce complexity, right? We still want our applications to be simple, be easy to work with, easy to maintain, and easy to extend. If we're writing really complex applications that are difficult to add on to and maintain, kind of defeating the purpose here. The other one is scalability. These applications need to be able to scale. So kind of similar with what we were just saying on the reduce complexity. They need to be scalable. They need to be able to, we can add to it. We can take it to NgRx if we want to, or we can continue to make more complex pages within our application if we need it. All right, so let's talk about a few core concepts here. Who's familiar with Container Presenter? Couple hands, few more. All right, great. So this is probably the number one thing that I've been teaching people lately is Container Presenter. It's the one pattern that if you start to master this, it will change how you develop code. Okay, and Container Presenter is also known as smart components and dumb components. This actually comes from Dan Abramoff, and when we talk about Redux, this is some of the original thinkings and design around Redux as a pattern, but it actually has nothing to do with Redux itself. It's just a really nice way of developing components. So we'll get into that a little bit. The other core concept we're going to talk about is service with a subject. Anybody heard of service with a subject? Besides Brian? Nobody? All right, excellent. Great. So we're going to learn about service with a subject and why that's important and how that is going to change the game for you, combined with the Container Presenter pattern. Okay, so when we talk about container components or smart components, these are top level features or pages typically. Now there's some exceptions to that, but if you think about it, if I have a dashboard, that would be a container. It would have a bunch of other components in it called presentation components or presenters. They can contain child components and they can contain other containers. But I usually try to tell people, like, start out with just seeing as a container as being a page. And then if you happen to have a group of presenters or presenter components that are being reused over and over on pages that all have the same exact logic that you're copying, now you have a use case to create basically like a sub-container that can be shared across these multiple pages, and we can isolate that logic to a single set of source. So what do containers do other than be top level features, right? Well, they control page flow. They decide how to go load data, where we're going to save things, how we're going to handle events, okay? So they're handling all the events from child components and then deciding what happens. Who has components right now where in the child component, when they go to click on something, it says, hey, if this variable, whether it be an input or from our lovely session service that we all have, we don't want to admit, that we, if this session service dot variable equals this value or is within this range, then my component should react like this. I should go ahead and save it, insert it. And then otherwise, let's go ahead and do the update, right? So we can actually eliminate all of that logic, and the containers then will receive child events saying, hey, look, somebody said save on this. Somebody clicked this magic button here and I'm supposed to tell you about it. And then your component, your container can decide, what are you gonna do with it? How are we gonna react to this? So it kind of leads into now the presentation components and understanding what presentation components do. Their primary job is present data. They don't know where it comes from. They don't understand it. They just go, man, I'm going to make it pretty. I'm going to make this the best looking UI you've ever seen. But if you ask me where the data came from, I don't know. It kind of came from above and I got it, and here it is. Look, it's all, in its glory. I've made it look really nice for you. And then make things pretty. It knows nothing about services, stores, anything like this. Okay, if you start to your presentation components have services and stores in them, those are now containers. They're not presentation components. You're breaking the pattern. So the other thing that they do here is they defer. What I mean by that is that they're very simple components, and instead of saying, hey, look, somebody clicked on the product, hey, I know what to do, I'll go do this. No, they defer and say, hey, somebody clicked on one of these things called a product. I don't really know what it is, but I'll tell you about it. So, hey, here's the product they clicked on. What do you want to do with it? And they emit an event up to the container. Okay, now the container can go ahead and decide how to work with it. So they receive, as I kind of said a little bit earlier, they don't know where the data comes from, so they receive their data via inputs. Who's passing data down to components, to their presentation components or something like this, using inputs and passing data down to them? Anybody? A few of you? Okay. So as I said, they're going to raise events to the parent container, defer. So let's take a quick second here before we get into the what if my page is simple part. Why do we do this? Well, so when we talk about wanting to share components, the number one problem that we have is Michael will write a component. He'll put a little bit of logic in there saying, hey, if this condition occurs, or actually he'll usually write it just for his needs, and then I'll get it, go like, hey, this is a really nice component. That's pretty much everything I needed to do, except for it doesn't quite do this one thing the way I want. So then I'll have either an input that I'm passing in, or I'll bring my service in, and then I'll say, hey, if this condition exists, then do it like this. Otherwise, go ahead and do it how Michael does it. And Alex comes along and says, man, this is a really nice component, but it doesn't quite work the way that I want. So I'm going to either get another service, or maybe that service already has it, or I'm going to pass it in as an input. And I'm going to say, hey, if this condition exists, do it like this. Otherwise, check the other condition. Otherwise, go ahead and do it like Michael wanted originally. And then you come along and go like, well, this is a really nice component, but all this is garbage. She takes it, copies it, rips all the stuff out of it, and puts it into her project or her page the way that she wants it, right? So are we really creating reusable components? No. And in fact, what we're actually creating is components that are going to create really bad scenarios for us, often during testing or during the application, when it's running in production, where all of a sudden the component starts behaving in a very unexpected way. And it's because we're not expecting the value to get updated from the session service or this other place, and it gets a wrong value. And now it starts working in a way that we weren't quite expecting for our page. Okay. So the idea here is that if we defer what's happening up to the container can decide, and we have a very reusable component. The containers themselves are the ones that are going to orchestrate everything. So the question here is, what if my page is really simple? What if I'm going like, man, do I really want to create, like I got a page here that's got a grid on it, okay? And on that grid, I'd have a container that would actually load the data, handle the click events, do whatever it's going to do, right? And we have a presentation component that would display the data just for the grid. It's only two pieces. It's pretty simple. Should I do this? Should I actually like go through this process? Yes. My answer to you is yes, do it anyway. Kind of an old adage is it only takes one person that shows that they don't care to silently give everyone else, the other developers, permission to come along behind you to just, the original guy didn't care about it. Why should I care about it? I'll just slap this down and we'll just keep going. And we'll just add to the problem. So it's really simple to be able to create containers and presenters. We can do it very, very quickly using the Angular CLI. You guys are all using the CLI for generation, right? You know, it's nice and easy. I can key these things up really, really fast. You know, the other nice thing here by doing this is I can avoid subscriptions. When I'm going to pass the data down from the controller or the container down to the presenter, I can use an async pipe. It's nice, it's clean, and I send the data right down. We'll actually take a look at some examples here in a few minutes, but I can avoid subscriptions. I'm not doing any sort of weirdness here. The async pipe really helps with that, and I get consistency. When I go back to look at this application a year from now, and I start to look at some code, I'm like, who wrote this? You know, ever had that? And all of a sudden you realize it was you that wrote it. And you're like, oh my God, I thank God I don't code that anymore, right? But especially when we don't do things consistently, that really happens. It jumps out. We're like, well, why did I choose this? Why? I mean, all these pages are all done the same way except for this page. Consistency is a really big deal, and especially when we're introducing new team members into the application, and then, oh, well, yeah, but then there's this page, right? You really want to avoid that. The other one is keep it simple, silly, as I like to say. If you're doing things consistent, it's going to be a lot easier to explain it and work with it later. So let's talk a little bit more and see a visual here on Container Presenter. So you might be able to see up the top there, it says app customers. You all see that? And then I've got my square brackets around customers. So I'm setting over here on my presentation, it's got an app input for customers. So I'm creating the app customers presentation object from within my container, and I'm passing it customers $. I like to have the suffix of $sign on any observables that I have. That way I know that this is a stream and it's not just a standard old variable. This will become more important to you later when you start doing more advanced form stuff. But you can see there, I'm using the async pipe. So I don't have to say, like right now, most people, how they're doing it is they make a service call, they go get the data, they make the service call, they subscribe to it, they take a local variable and now set it to the data that came back, and then they'll pass that, they'll use that in their component, right? And then we need to make sure that we deal, if we're doing any operations on that, we might need to unsubscribe to that, make sure that properly gets released, and then we're not wasting memory away. But in this case here, it makes it nice and clean. I just use the async pipe. And as you'll see how we actually get this data down, we just say, hey, my observable equals the call to the service. I don't subscribe to it. I save 3 or 4 lines worth of code every single time. It makes it really nice. And then on my click event, I have a click event here that is for my presentations click event. I want to have a handler here to be my click handler. So this is where whatever they click on in the form, and they're like, hey, click, on something, that I'm going to now handle that at my container. And all my presentation component is going to do is receive whatever was clicked on, and then raise the emit the event up. And then my container is going to get it. This is actually, I don't know if you noticed, but this is actually the same slide I use when I'm describing NgRx, because this pattern's exactly the same. And so I just actually borrowed the slide because it's exactly the same way of doing it. So let's talk about what a service with a subject is, because this is actually where the real power here is. And this is a big reason why I wrote this presentation, is because I've heard a lot of talk about service with a subject, but I've seen very few examples. There's very few articles out there. It's not a really well talked about subject, other than saying, hey, you should really consider service with a subject. Hence, I'm like, all right, well, let's have a little talk about it. So what is it? Well, one, it's just a service. We don't even write it in a special way. There's a couple little things that we're going to do differently, but overall, it's just an injectable service that works like every other service. It has a local variable that's going to be exposed that we can get our data from. So instead of depending on the get call, let's say we're going to take a look at a second here at the widget service, and it's going to be get all. And instead of having our container, local variable equal the service call observable that's coming back. No. We're actually going to have our variable just equal to the local variable of the subject. And we're going to point it at that. And when we make our get all call to the service, what we're going to get back from that, what's going to happen is it's going to update and it's going to emit a value onto that stream. And now everybody's going to know about it. Who's ever tried to do this? Because this has been a really big problem within Angular for a while, which is, okay, look, I'm sharing data. I've got it in some service here that we're hoping that all these different components will be able to use. But then we have to create this really wild eventing system to notify all the components, and they all have to subscribe to it and go, oh yeah, now give me the new data, and then I'll try to re-render myself and get things all straightened out. And it works great like the first 3, 4, 5 times, right? But as then our application grows and it grows in complexity, it just becomes this wild eventing, Wild West deal, and you don't know what's firing what anymore. So really common problem, and that's what this solves. So let's also talk really quick about a subject versus a behavior subject. Did anybody know the difference? So it's not something that's kind of obvious. Really, the biggest difference is this: is that a subject's like, hey, here. You can subscribe to it, and as soon as somebody says, hey, here's a new value, it'll give you the new value. That's great, but what if I arrive to the party 5 minutes after it started, or 5 milliseconds in the case of programming, after the party has started? Well, I don't get the data. It's just like, well, no, nothing to report, man. Everything's cool here. Where a behavior subject is actually going to tell me this is the last value that was emitted. This is the current value that's out there. So go ahead and use this one. So this helps us with our timing issues of making sure, when does my component subscribe? When am I actually getting that data? I don't have to worry about that. So what are we going to create here? What are we going to look at? We're going to take a look at a little bit of sample code to kind of bring this all together. So hopefully you'll be able to see how you'd be able to implement this in your application. That's really my hope for you, is that tomorrow you're going to work, you're all jazzed, you're pumped, you get up there, you get there at 6:30 a.m. and you're like, man, let's code, because you're so excited about how can I do service with a subject, man? So we're going to create a dashboard component. We're going to create a nav bar with a little role control. This is going to be a really simple UI, like that simple of a UI. So it's going to have a nav bar with a role control. So that's up here. Here's the nav bar. This is my dashboard page itself. Then I have 2 controls, one that has a list of users and another one that shows the permissions for it. So there we go. So I have a users list presenter. So the dashboard itself is the controller. And it has the users list presenter and the permissions presenter as well. So, and our nav bar is also a presenter. So we have 1 container, 3 presenters. And then we're going to share the same exact user data between the 2 the users and permissions. All right, so let's get started. Let's take a look at our dashboard page and kind of dig into this. So before we look at code, I'm just going to show you really quick what it does, and then you guys can just ooh and ah about how awesome this is. And really, it's designed to be super simple so you get the concept, and we don't have a lot of other confusing things going on. So I can select either an admin or I'm a standard user. So when I go to admin, I have a bug or something's going on here. Well, it looks like I've successfully broken the application. Amongst all the confusion, we'll actually take a look in here and see if it's there's something I've done that's causing that issue. Let's actually, do we have an error here? No. Admin, standard. This is good. This was working just a few hours ago. We'll figure that out as we go here, hopefully. Let me make this just a little bit bigger. This is the curse of the live code thing, right? I mean, that's why I usually have everybody in the front row sign a waiver. Something's going to blow up, and yeah, this happens a lot to me personally. So, all right, let's take a look at our application. So here we've got a module called dashboard. You can tell that it's a module because it's got a dashboard module file here. And then I have two folders, one called containers, one called components. I like to be able to separate my containers from my components. The components are my presenters, right? So here, if I look at my container, I've got my dashboard. That's the only one that's in there. My HTML, that's my CSS. My HTML is really simple. All I'm doing here is I've got my nav bar. I'm watching for my change event there. And then I've got my app user list and my app permissions. I'm passing data async pipe down, and all I'm doing on my style is float left, 50-50, boom, we're good. Nice and simple UI here, right? Now, when I look at my dashboard component itself, it's a very simple component as well. Let's go ahead and break this down. So the dashboard component is bringing in the user service. And the user service, now we're going to use, here's our load all call. So that actually might be my problem right there. Because I'm changing what the output is, but we'll take a look here. So what I'm doing here is I've got a user's property that is of type observable with a user array. So that's what I'm expecting to get back as a stream of users. So anytime I get an update, man, I'm going to get that. Anytime a value is emitted, I'm going to get that new value, and I'm going to then propagate that down to my children. So I'm going to go ahead and set that user variable, observable variable, equal to the user service users. And then I am going to set the, oh, that's what it is. So last time I did this talk, it actually, I left some bad code in here. And that's probably what's causing the problem. So the users, as I said, I'm setting that to the service. I'm getting that local variable. And then I'm making my call to the user service using just the word standard. So that's my standard user. And then when the role changes, which you say, well, where does the role change happen? That's what we're getting from the child component from the nav bar. It's sending the role change up. And when that happens, we're going to call user service list again, but we're going to pass it that role. Okay, so we're just defaulting the first time here to get on the initialization that we're going to start out with a standard user. All right, now everybody cross your fingers. We're going to go back to the page and see if it's working now. Oh, look at that. Okay, I think we might be fixed. So now you can see instead of 3 users, we've got 2 users, and we still have Steve Whitman's name, last name spelled wrong. Sorry, Steve. But we've got Steve and Brian, and then we're showing permissions for Steve and Brian both being standard users. Now, when I come over here and I say admin, now since I'm an admin, I can see myself here and any other admins, and I see the full list of users. I go back to standard, and it goes ahead and eliminates that down. Now notice, I'm not doing any crazy eventing. Well, you don't know that yet, but we'll look at it here, and you'll see in a second. There's no crazy eventing going on. I'm not doing anything. I'm not having to do a whole bunch of wire up. So because I'm dealing with streams, and I have a service with a behavior subject, the child components are automatically getting updated. So let's dig in a little further here. So we'll come back over to dashboard just to prove it, just so you can all see one last time. Here's our role change. That's where we're getting the role that's being passed up. And again, we're not doing anything magical here. All we're doing is async pipe down to the child with that list of users. So we're unwrapping the observable, and it's getting just an array. So now let's go look at our actual, these are our presenters. And the first one we're going to look at is the top nav. The top nav is actually more complicated than it needs to be, and mostly just because we just have these 2 options in here, and we're not loading those in a more traditional way. They're just hard-coded in there. But on the change of this is where we're calling our on-roll change. There's nothing else magical happening there. And the second part here, as you can see, on roll change, all we're doing is we're emitting the role that is selected. At this point, this is our model. We're actually using 2-way data binding here. Don't tell anybody. This is on the web, though. So you can see I've got my output, and I've got my role change event emitter of type string. That's going to emit then whatever the role is, whether it's admin or it's a standard user. Great. So now if we come over here to our users list, it's really nothing more than saying, hey, let's use NG4, use our decorator there to enumerate over users, and we're displaying the user ID and the username. No magic, okay? If we look at what's actually in here, it's nothing. In fact, actually, both of these could be deleted. Implements on a init could be deleted, and that's as simple as my component could really be. It's only receiving the input. Now, who would rather test this component and write unit tests for this one, or the one that we were talking about that's got, a couple of services injected, we got some other inputs, and we got this nasty if then, and try to figure out whether or not it does the right thing, right? Captain Obvious here, right? This is the one we all want to test. This is the reusable component. If you wrote all your components like this and did presentation components that actually display the data, this is massively reusable. People from other teams will be able to take your components and be able to wire them up, give them the data that they want, and then handle the click events they want. That's a beautiful thing. Set that back, otherwise I'll forget, and of course it'll break when I do my next presentation. All right, so the permissions one, it's the same exact thing. We're not displaying the ID, we're just displaying the name and the role, but all we're doing is enumerating over the users in it. All right, great. So where's the magic at? How's this actually happening? Well, we briefly touched on it in the container for what's really the magic happens here, the user service, and right here. So why don't we go take a look at that really quick and see what's happening there. So over here, I'm going to show you two different versions. I'm going to show you first the widget service, because this is the really simplified version, and then we'll talk about why the user service was done just a little bit different than this. Okay, one, by the way, this is using in-memory database, so we're not actually connecting out to an API. The code here is available in a repository. I will post this to my feed so you can get it, and you can pull down the source code. You can pull down the slides. You can, we'll actually have some videos. We'll have some links for you on that as well. Have a video available to you so you can hear my wonderful voice again, walking you through all these different examples. So in my case here, you see I've got a widget, and so here I've got widget $ equals a new behavior subject, and it's a widget array. So, and we're defaulting it with an empty array right there. So as you see here, empty array. So this is what's creating our behavior subject, and this is what we're connecting to from our container component. So now we point at that, and anytime that we get a new value on widgets $, those values are going to then be emitted onto the stream, and we'll pick those up automatically. So in our case here, we've got a call called just get all, and this should look very familiar to you. It's using the HTTP client, and it's calling a get, and we're specifying the type, but it should be a widget array, and we're subscribing to that, and we're taking the widgets that are returned, and we are calling next on those widgets, and doing it like that. So the beauty here is that now we're updating this behavior subject. It's getting those widgets for us. As you guys may know, the HTTP client will auto-destroy itself, so we don't actually have to worry about it. We're not doing any other operations on it that would prevent it from doing garbage collection. So this is okay. So I've got my subscribe here. It's getting that value emitted onto it, and nice and simple. But this isn't the actual example that we use with the user service. So let's take a look at that one next. So the user service is a little bit more complex, but it's basically the same thing. We've got our behavior subject up here. We've got our variable that's exposed for that, so that we can go ahead and bind to that. And then we have a function called list. List is what we are using to be able to get either the admin version of the list or the standard version of the list. So we pass that in on the role. We're using the same type of get, making that call out there, and then we're subscribing, taking the users, and we are putting in a new value onto the stream using next. But here we're doing something a little different. And imagine now, again, we're using a real API here. If it was a real API, we wouldn't do it this way, because we wouldn't need to. The API, up on the server would say, hey, let's go ahead and eliminate and only show admin versus, or show all with admin, or show just the limited with the standard. But since our service here needs to kind of fake a few things out, this is how we chose to do it to make it simple. But the widget one is actually what you'd really want to do. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that that was clear for everybody. So when you do write it, this is more of what you want it to look like. This here is our poor man's filtering version here, so we can make our UI work the way that we want without having a real service or all that overhead. All right, so great. I think we're doing pretty good on time here. So in summary, the container presenter maximizes reusability. And honestly, if you don't even use the service with the subject, if all you get from tonight is, hey, I'm going to start working with container presenter and I'm going to try to start simplifying my applications, then hallelujah, like that's a huge plus for you. This is going to make your life a lot easier. You're going to write better code, and you're going to have team members love you because your components are going to be reusable and theirs are not, right? So hopefully everybody starts to adapt this. This is a really easy concept to use, but it's one that escapes us in the Angular world, and I'd really like to see more people using it. So the other part here is service with a subject to share data. Notice how easy it is to be able to share data, and you could have multiple different containers on different pages. Let's say like you load your permissions in once, or you load your roles in once on your auth service. You don't have to, you can reuse those from container to container to container. And then all of a sudden, let's say if you switch to an impersonation mode and it loads up a new set of roles, and make some changes there, bam, your components are automatically going to get updated with those. You don't have to do anything special. And that is huge in being able to do more complicated pages. And the best part here is it's going to be really easy for you to upgrade to NgRx if you want to. The great thing about NgRx, and I'm a huge proponent of it, so it's funny for me to do a talk called I'm Not Ready for NgRx, and I tell everybody, no, you're ready, let's do it. It's going to be great. But the great thing about this is that your application doesn't have to be NgRx all the way through. In fact, a really common scenario that we see a problem with application development is basically teams go to the nth level to make sure that every page does NgRx. And maybe we don't actually need to do that. Maybe it actually makes more sense to say, let's take the 3 or 4 really complex pages and let's have them use the store. That's the really appropriate way to do this. And that the other pages that are more simple, that will actually just use service with a subject. So we're now still have really clean pages. We're still very consistent in how we do things. Really complex goes this way. Not as complex can go this way. And we can build these applications much more quickly and not have to maybe necessarily put everything into the store. Again, that's for you to decide. The GitHub repo, it's pretty simple. If you just go out to GitHub and search for Rebug, you'll find this repo and several other ones that we make available. I will also be posting this on my Twitter stream, just to let you guys know, and Brian briefly covered this. Really, what does Rebug do? We do application development for clients. We don't work on any products ourselves, internally for ourselves. We help clients achieve their dreams and help them build out their next level of enterprise applications. A lot of times it starts out with architecture reviews, just coming in and taking a look around about what you're doing and making sure it's following the best practices that are coming down from the Google team and the Angular team, right? We do some customized training. So I regularly teach training classes, not only here in Denver, but also across the country. We also do Angular consulting and staff augmentation. So if you need help getting a project up and going and get the team up to speed after training, we can be there to help you build, whatever it is that you want to build. Follow me if you would, Jesse S_Rebug. I will be posting, like I said, the slides, the code, and a link to the video tomorrow morning on this. So definitely do that. Also, if you have questions on service with the subject and you want to get some answers and you're like, look, I'm too shy to raise my hand right now because we're going to go to questions in just a second, then email me. That's my real email address. It doesn't go to some pseudo folder. It goes to my real email. So I'm happy to respond, happy to get you some help and point you in the right direction. So with that, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Is there other trade-offs when components get deeply nested as far as like passing things down a long chain of components and then having to output all the way back up as far as like figuring out where things are happening and loading it?
Yes.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, it can. I think you've got to make logical decisions. So the question, just for the online audience, is that are there special considerations when we talk about nesting components multiple levels deep and passing stuff down and then getting it back up out? Yeah, anytime we're creating a component hierarchy, it needs to be thought out and well planned, and there's some special considerations for that. We definitely don't want to just keep passing stuff, the same data, all the way down this chain. We might want to take a look at how we're composing our components and making sure, like, hey, where does it really need to be at, that we're from the container down to the presentation component. I don't think there's any like one prescription that fits all. I think it's on a case-by-case basis, but you want to try to minimize that so that you're not having this huge chain of passing data down. But that's a really good question for maybe, an offline. We could go down a rabbit hole, maybe over a beer. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I saw the NgRx and I immediately thought that Angular had like absorbed RxJS and renamed the API, but obviously that's not the case. So with this, you're just going package.json, NgRx added in, and then you're just pulling in, and it's like loading your ability to like interact with the components that load up. So you can say if it's a chart, click on the chart, and it's taking you somewhere. Is that the purpose of NgRx?
Well, okay, so I'm not totally sure I understand your question, because you're kind of jumping around, and there's a couple things I'm not sure that totally makes sense. But let's talk about NgRx and RxJS and Angular really quick here. So Angular, you've got a lot of choices. You can implement this in a lot of different ways. RxJS is the observables library, and the observables library allows you to deal with streams versus promises. Promises, you get one shot. Hey, here's your data. Boom, done. We're out. Okay, you have to now make another call and then resolve that one for you to get a new value. Where streams is like, hey, I can get a pointer to that stream, and as many times as it emits values, I can get new values, and then those automatically get distributed to the children. So that's kind of the base premise for both NgRx and service with a subject. Service with a subject is just a much simpler way of doing things. I don't have to plan out my actions. I don't have to create reducers, effects, selectors, whatnot. And so I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Because it was, when I saw it, immediately my brain started making connections to what I'd already known about it, but I've never heard of the NgRx, so I was like, how does this relate? And I see the Rx in there, so I'm like, it's responsive style. But
yeah, so NgRx is basically an Angular version of Redux that uses the RxJS library. So Angular is already basically built upon RxJS. So a lot of common pieces that we use, like the HTTP client, that returns everything as observables coming out of there. You can still do promises if you want, if that's what you're comfortable with, but you actually have to convert observables to promises and make that call. But that's, I think the power with NgRx is because it is observables. And we now have streams of data versus just a one-off, hey, here's my data. So another great one that we can probably sit down and chat with the beer over here. All right, you sir.
Yeah, so you went over a good kind of sample of how to set things up to move to NgRx. What would you say would be kind of the next step or the next thing to look into in moving to NgRx?
Oh, okay. So the question is, what would be the next steps then of how would I want to, like, how would I prepare to move for NgRx? So in this case here, I would start with looking at my UI. Okay, I would start to look at what are the things that are occurring on this page. Now this, mind you, is a very simple page. And really we have one basic action that's occurring that's obvious, and that is a role change. Okay, so I would want to have a role change action. And what I want to then go ahead and create an action for that. Then the other one's not quite as obvious, and that is I want to load users. Okay, and it's kind of, it's not really obvious because it happens, but I don't really see it unless I go look at the code. So in that case there, what we want to have happen is we need to be able to load users, and we need to be able to handle the success block and the fail block. Okay, so if something fails, I want to have a little toaster message that says, hey, something went wrong, not sure, do you want to try again, whatnot. And on the success, I want it to actually update the user's piece so that I now have that. So that's the first step, is you're going to start to plan out your actions. And then from those actions, you're going to create reducers. How does that affect then my state in the store? So on the role change, that one's really not going to have a reducer, but it's going to have an effect. Okay, so effects handle my asynchronous effects that happen in the application. And so that would be the one that would be calling to the service. And then on the success of that, it would say, okay, the user success, here's the list of users, update the store with it. And on a failure, it would say, hey, we have a failure one, and then it would do what it's going to do there appropriately, right? And so really in this case here, we'd have three actions that we'd be writing. We'd then have, it looks like 2 reducers, and we would have 1 effect method to do the load. And then from there, we'd need selectors. So you could also argue in this very simple case that we could actually do the same exact thing that we're doing for filtering, that we could actually do that with selectors instead and be able to do it that way. That once we actually set the role and we have that value, then the selector would automatically, we'd use that role and say, okay, hey, now here's your data based off your role. Okay, but again, it really depends on how your application is really built. Most applications aren't really manipulating the service data like what we're doing for this example. All right, one more question.
Okay, so you showed us a service with a subject example. Can you think of some type of service or data where service with a subject would not really be appropriate for?
Where would service with a subject not be appropriate? I can't think of a place where it wouldn't be appropriate. Now, you might decide that this is still too complicated, and I need NgRx. I need to abstract away additional complexity. But most things could be done with service with a subject. Let me give you an example of this, because this actually might be what you're looking for. So where is it where a service with a subject really wouldn't help me? I'll give you an example. I was working with, does anybody know Joe Eames at all? Or heard of him? So he's a really well-known Pluralsight author. He writes a lot of content on Angular, really great guy. And him and I were collaborating on one of his projects called ngdoc.io. And he had a component page for displaying a list of articles, and it had a really complicated piece around tags. So at first, what he wanted to display is, I'm going to show you a list of popular articles, and then I'm going to give you a list of popular tags. Cool. And then if I click a tag, it would then only show me tags for the remaining articles that are unique, because each article would have multiple tags. So it would show me a unique list of the remaining tags based on the articles that are now being displayed. Okay, great. And then the other option is I can search for tags. And so he had this really nasty logic. There was this really complicated piece, and it needed its own little block header saying, please do not touch. This is highly volatile. We're not quite sure how it totally works, but it kind of does. And it had a lot of these really crazy if then variable cases. And what we ended up doing with it is we rewrote it into NgRx, and we used selectors to figure out which data to display for tags based on, hey, does get latest from, do we have a search parameter? Yes, we do. Okay, so we know we're only showing tags that that match the search criteria. Do we have a single tag selected? Yes, we do. Now only show tags from, get a list of the articles and get me a unique list of tags for those articles. Service with a subject would not help you. You would still have the complexity. You'd be like, hey, fantastic. I have tag data, I have article data, and I've got a really nice way that I can share and make these simple as behavior subjects, but it's not really reducing my complexity. So that's the one example I can think of. All right, I think you get both of these t-shirts, don't you? All right. Steve's a regular. All right, we'll take one more question. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. Really appreciate it. Again, you can reach me here with my Twitter handle. I regularly respond on that. You can also get me via email. I'll be posting the slides and all the other information. So thanks for coming out. Hopefully we'll see you next door.